Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jason Buffington with Veeam. You'll notice this week I have a different host, and normally Dave Russell joins us for our Monday Live Insights. This week we have Julie Webb. Julie, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Thanks, Jason. I'm glad to be here.
So Julie is the unsung hero in all the research that Dave and I typically get the chance to cover. Julie is our director of research and market analysis at Veeam. Tomorrow, in fact, by this time tomorrow, the Data Protection Trends 2022 report will be live. So take a look at the link. The link doesn't work yet, but if you go to VEE.am/DPR22. By this time tomorrow, when you refresh your browser, you'll have fresh data. But this is our third out of 4 installments to sneak peek on this. While we get ready to do that, though, please give a shout out in the social media platform. Tell us where you're from. So I am from the great state of Texas. Julie hails from Ohio. Our producer is out of Georgia, social media out of Romania. There is a lot of the world that is not yet green this morning, and we'd love to fill those blanks in. So hopefully you've seen the first 2 installments. In the first one, we looked at some of the macro change drivers going on in data protection. Last week, we looked at the reality gap. Why is it that so many organizations are likely to change their primary data protection solution as they enter into 2022. This week, we're going to talk a little bit more about the why they're willing to change by looking at what their goals are. Now, Julie, as one of the 3 legs of the stool for making this research happen, let's bring up that first slide. And, when we looked at last week, we talked about the availability gap. Right? How long can you be down? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And the protection gap, how much data can you afford to lose? Here is the tolerable data loss slide from the DPR research that publishes tomorrow. Julie, walk us through what you see out of this.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to be covering why downtime and data loss matter from Veeam's latest research in the DPR report. So as we talk about tolerable data loss, the question here is around the amount of tolerable an organization can tolerate as it relates to data loss. Time spent in protecting high priority and normal applications is almost the same across the board. As we look at previous trends, over the past 15 plus years, critical data from high priority apps represented between 5 to 10% of the total data. And over the past 10 years, it's reached nearly 25% of the total data in the data center. The takeaway here is that the amount of critical data to be protected is increasing, but our ability to accept the amount of downtime and data loss has lessened.
So, okay, there's a lot to unpack in what you said. So one of the first things I think you mentioned that I really like is notice how the shape of the data is relatively the same between the two, right? So you mentioned that 15 years ago it would not be uncommon to do. We used to do all kinds of heroic things, right? So back when I didn't have gray hair. We would do SRDF and synchronous disk arrays and clustering and all these heroic measures for about 5 to 10% of the workloads in a given environment. Those were the mission critical applications that someone might have. And then there was the everything else, right? There was the, hey, nightly tape backup, that's all we can do. The problem with nightly tape backup is that let's assume that every night you do backups at midnight. And so if something broke at 8 a.m. in the morning, you didn't lose any data, right? People were just walking into work, no data loss. If the server crashed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you lost a whole day of data, right? And so split the difference and just presume that that servers always crash at noon. You always lose half a day of data, because when you say you protect nightly, you can always cut that value in half. Whatever your value of how frequently you protect, cut that in half, and that basically gives you how much your actual data loss window might be. And Julie, when I look at this data, one of the things I think is really interesting, well, 2 things. One, you mentioned the difference between high priority and normal, and so we see that in the yellow green on the left versus the bluish green on the right of each of those. The shape of the data is surprisingly similar. So walk us through, why is that? Why is it that we see that shape being so consistent?
Well, here is a 3-year trend, and so let's start with the high priority data. So as we look at the results, we see that high priority represents 205 minutes for the year of 2020, but by 2022, it actually represented 121 minutes. So let's look at normal data. And in 2020, this actually represented 663 minutes, but by 2022, it was actually 171 minutes.
Okay, so for the folks at home, let me. This was actually really surprising. When Dave and Julie and I looked at this data, to see that convergence was actually really surprising. So if we look at just the high priority data, so this was the tolerable amount of data loss. So 205 minutes, call it it's about 3.5 hours-ish, right? So you could lose about 3.5 hours or half a day of downtime or half a day of data loss, which was one of the measures we looked at earlier. So half a day of data loss. And then you would expect that each year, we've talked a lot about the increasing sensitivity for downtime and data loss. We talked about the protection gap and the reality gap last week. And you would expect that over time, people would continue to refine those expectations. So 205 goes down to 198, goes down to 121. That's reasonable, right? But just 2 years ago, the amount of downtime for the everything else, the normal amount of data that an organization could lose, Julie, that's 663 minutes. So that's just over 8 hours. So basically they said they could lose up to a day of data. And that, back to my earlier example, you could do with nightly tape backup, right? You could, you lose 8 hours of data, that's a day. But over that same 2-year period, we've gone from 8 hours down to, my math on here is 7 hours-ish, a little less than 7, down to just short of 3 hours in that same window. If we kind of double back on that, I mean, that we're seeing a convergence between high priority and normal as a path line. Any thoughts on why it is that we're seeing that convergence?
Well, let's take a look at downtime.
Well, before we look at downtime, let's just look at the data loss side for a few seconds, because I love some of the things that we're seeing in here. How do I say this differently? Let me go back a second. When we talk about this kind of a shape of data, two things kind of come to mind: the balancing, and I think one thing that that folks on the call might want to take away from this is that all data is important. Right. It used to be that if you could lose, say, a day of normal data, but you could only lose 3 hours of high priority data. So now what we want to do is you're seeing that shape is nearly the same. In fact, when you look at how much data could I lose in 1 hour, 55% of organizations said they could only lose up to an hour of their high priority data, whereas 49% of organizations said they could lose up to 49% of their normal data in the 1 hour or less. What I hope folks take away from this is you can't accomplish this kind of a recovery point objective, a tolerable data loss window. You can't accomplish that if the only thing you're doing is nightly backup. Right. This is one of the reasons why Veeam spends so much time on combining not only nightly backup, but also snapshots, right, within primary storage arrays. This is why we combine it with frequency replication, as well as continuous data protection. Now, in continuous data protection, you can get that window down that far left edge, right, into the minute or less range. When we look at regular replication, that's still giving you every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every hour. You're going to balance that with what are the demands for data loss versus the tax that adds onto the production server environment. It's one of the reasons why we combine with snapshots. So collectively, you can't accomplish this with backups alone. This is why we want to combine these into a single set of strategies along the way, because that convergence is happening, because what the data is telling us is that all data matters. All right. While you take those notes away, we've actually got quite a bit of folks who have piled onto the map. Let's take a look at where folks are coming in from. I mentioned earlier, so great state of Texas is representing in the House. New Mexico, my favorite neighbor to the west, and regular Mexico, my favorite neighbor to the south, are representing there as well. We see what is that, Minnesota and the Great Lakes up on the top. Indiana's weighing in, so welcome to those over there. Let's see, where else we got? So France is in the house, Trinidad, Tobago. Haven't seen them in here for a while. So, and did I see Iran and UAE on the, all right, cool. It's been a while since we had Iran on the call, so welcome, and also UAE, and then over some of my friends to the northeast up in India as well. So, please keep piling on, not only with where you're from, but if you have questions around what does downtime and data loss look like, we want to try to answer some of those questions as well. All right, so Julie, you mentioned this earlier, but I pulled you back a little bit. So we've talked about data loss. And one of the other things I think is interesting about data loss is that certainly it applies not only to those workloads that are on premise, but it equally applies to things like Salesforce and Office 365 and Azure hosting and even desktops, et cetera. But you wanted us to take a look at downtime. So let's talk about downtime and outages. What did you see there?
So the question we're looking at is around the amount of an organization can tolerate related to downtime. And so what we're seeing in this data is that high priority is at 110 minutes versus 134 minutes for normal applications for 1 hour or less to protect their data. So we also are seeing in these results 56% of high priority and 49% of normal applications experience downtime in less than 1 hour.
Okay, so a couple things to take away from this. Again, for the folks at home, notice that we're again seeing that there's not that much difference between normal workloads and high priority workloads from an outage perspective. So 110 minutes, so just short of 2 hours, 134 minutes, just over 2 hours, right? And I think there's a couple things you should take away from that. One, when Veeam has been in the virtualization business first and foremost for the last 15 years. And when you look at, it was pretty easy when you looked at physical servers, right? You could look at a physical box and you could even put like little colored flags on it, right? So, green is a normal server and yellow is hey, this is kind of important, and the red must run all the time. Right. And when I first started in this industry, that's where clustering was, and that's where SRDF was, and that's where you would put in those heroics to make sure that app would never fail. The problem today is that if you walk into a modern data center, a physical data center, and you look at a rack of servers, one virtualization host may have 15 virtualized machines running in it, and it's going to be a mix of mission critical, business critical, high priority, normal, and low priority. When that one physical host goes down, all those VMs go down. I think that's one of the things which is contributing to this flattening of expectations, right? Also, if you think about from a coworker perspective, when coworkers talk about, hey, I need to do my job, they're not thinking in terms of, high priority workloads versus normal workloads. They're thinking in terms of, I need to do my job, right? IT just needs to work. And so we do see that flattening. That said, as one would expect, high priority does lean a little bit to the left, but really just not that much. This, again, just think about that flattening along the way. It's one of the reasons why using a software-based approach, like what Veeam does, so that you have that same level of failoverableness, I think that's a word, across all the workloads, and not having to do special architectures where you cluster your front end databases, you mirror your the back end stores, you DFS or DFSN the file shares. Instead of having those different kinds of heroics to meet this across the way, as long as it's virtualized, you can have the same level of RTO, recovery time objective, for all the workloads that are within our environment. Okay, so Julie, this talks about the expectation of tolerable downtime. So let's talk a little bit more about, how real is this problem? How frequently are servers really going down?
So we'll talk about real world outages as it relates to frequency next. The question is, what was the percentage of servers that had at least one unexpected outage over the past year? So this is really a broad distribution in these results that you're seeing. On average, what we see that 40% of servers have had at least one unexpected outage over the past 12 months. And what this really tells us is stuff just breaks.
Fair enough. So Nagesh actually put a question in on this. Let's revisit that. So Nagesh was asking, why is the slope reduced for recovery time objectives so fast? And I think I'd argue two things. We actually saw a little bit of this when we were talking about the availability gap and the protection gap last week. And one of if there's a couple things that that the global pandemic has taught us, one of them certainly is the dependency on data. Right, when everyone had to be reinvented, especially into a remote workforce, and people are working remotely at really all times of day and evening, as some of those walls have kind of eroded down, what folks are seeing is a dependency on the data. Just the expectation it's going to have to be there, right? And I think we see that again, not only in RTO, Ragesh, which is your question, so thank you for that, but also in RPO. Right. Even if I were to say do something like Office 365 and something has corrupted or something has been erroneously deleted. In fact, we'll talk about why data is lost in just a few seconds. But on all of those scenarios, to be able to say, oh, I'll just put it back to what it was from last night. Right. That's not OK anymore. Right. If I'm dialing in for a couple hours, if I'm on my VPN, or if I'm using my data and I'm trying to send mails from home or as we return back to the workplace, to be able to come in and find out, oh, by the way, the servers are down for a couple hours, but if you'll just wait till this afternoon, it'll be fine. Right? That's not okay. Right? So I do think that over the last couple of years, especially as we've modernized production, right? Especially as you think about when we've modernized production and moved more and more towards things like as a service, software as a service in particular, and things like infrastructure as a service, where there is a higher level of resiliency natively built into the production platforms. If that's true, then we should expect that our data protection solutions should also accommodate that same level of resiliency as well. But that said, let's talk a little about how and why stuff breaks. And Julie, you mentioned this before. Stuff is breaking, right? I do think it's interesting though. 2 out of 5, right? So if the question is, and folks at home, ask yourself this question, or if you can, go to your favorite systems management tool. Go to the Windows log, go to your favorite host system log, and you will find servers burp, right? Servers break. But the idea that 2 out of 5 servers have at least one failed outage per year, that's pretty remarkable. So, all right, but let's take a look at outage causality for a few seconds, and then we'll double back to the map in just a second. Julie, so in this case, walk us. So there's a lot of data on the slide. Can you unpack? How was the question asked? What are we looking at with these 3 bars? And then what did you see in the data?
This is one of my favorite slides of the entire DPR report. And the question was around the most common cause of an outage that your organization has experienced, and which one was most impactful as we compare the 2020 results to 2021. And we see from these results that cyber represents over 50% of the results here, as well as accidental deletion is top of the list. But there's a second macro trend that we're really seeing here is that all causes are ranked high across the board. And this is really telling us that bad things happen. It's getting worse. And the underlying message is that I need help.
Sure.
So you can't just mobilize on one thing. You really, as a result, need backup.
So when you're looking at the slide can be a little intimidating when you first look at it. So let's break down how the question was asked. So there's actually two questions that are here. The first question is, select all the causes of outages that might apply. Right. And so that's what you see in those long lines to the right hand side. So, Julie, you mentioned, cybersecurity, 51% of organizations claim that. The most common outages, those ones to the far right hand edge. Hold on while I sneeze.
Bless you.
Why do I always sneeze when it's my turn to talk? So the lines, the lines to the far right, that's where we see the most common outages. And there is an interesting trend that the most common things really are just stuff breaks, right? Infrastructure breaks, server hardware breaks, OS applications crash, really a lot around just breakage. Now, that was the first question. Check all that apply. Most common causes was outage. Next, customers were asked, or respondents, excuse me, not customers, unbiased data. Respondents were asked, what was the most impactful outage of the year? And that's where you start to see those dark blue lines and those light green lines. One of the fun parts about this particular data protection project is we've asked this question 2 years in a row. And so for our 2021, you can see that cyber is number one, that it was almost a tie, less than a tenth of a point difference, for accidental deletion being the second most common, or excuse me, most impactful. We asked the same question last year in 2020, about 2020 outages. And you see that that lime green that comes in as well. So that's how you kind of break down the ones to the right are most common. The short lines are most impactful. And for the second year in a row, cyber events were the most impactful. Outages were the most common. But I do want to kind of draw folks' eyes to two other elements on here. One is take a look at the number 2. Dave Russell is famous for always looking for the boundary conditions on this. But take a look at the number 2, accidental deletion, overwriting of data corruption, just the fact that, the data can go away either by omission, by a user who overwrites last month's budget with this month's budget, someone who thinks they're cleaning up their home directory and is actually cleaning up a shared directory. User stuff happens, right? And actually the second most common, or excuse me, most impactful type of outage is users. Now, to be clear, when you say users, don't overgeneralize that as also like IT pros. In fact, administrators were actually the least likely, most common and most impactful outage there. Admittedly, it might have been administrators who were also taking this survey, and so they might have underestimated their impact, but we'll leave that argument for a different day. In the meantime, though, causes of outages is a big deal. What I hope you take away, we talked last week about ransomware being a when, not an if. Outages, as Julie mentioned, stuff is still breaking. In the meantime, though, don't forget, users do user stuff. And that's still one of the most predominant reasons why we still do backups. Let's look at where the users are coming from. Let's look at where the responses are coming in from. We've had quite a bit of success today. Let's see. So Canada's in the house. We love when Canada's in the house, right? A whole big chunk of the world turns green. So yay for that. Tennessee is representing. Ohio, I think we already saw. Pennsylvania. Man, the northeast is really representing today. So thank you for that. Let's go look at the old country. I see Slovakia in the house. All right. Let's see, down south of me quite a ways. I saw Mexico earlier, Costa Rica, I think. Represents for that. And then what do we got? Palestine. Been a while since we've seen them. Egypt. often on the show. So thank you for that. And then Nigeria, it's been a while since they've been on as well. So thank you for those as well. Kimberly asked a question earlier. Would like to set up a review. Yeah, absolutely. If this data would be interesting to any of you, so this time tomorrow, a lot of stuff's happening. I think it's like 7 a.m. East Coast. The report and all of this data goes live. There'll be a blog. In the blog, we actually walk through some of this data as well. Julie, you've got a blog actually on this particular topic coming up in about 2 or 3 weeks along the way. But yes, you'll see blogs, you'll see videos, an infographic. There's an exec brief that talks about outage causality as well. So yes, by this time tomorrow, you should have quite a bit of extra resources. And if there's anything that you really want to really dig into more, you can actually reach Julie and I via email at strategicresearch@veeam.com. So any kind of follow-ups on this, weigh into the social media, but strategicresearch@veeam.com, and we're happy to help you with any and all of this data along the way. All right, I think that's about it. Again, just, big plug. By this time tomorrow, the data's out. Julie, this project has been, 7 months in the making? It's been exciting.
Yes, it has. And it's finally happening. We are more than excited about that.
Yeah, so as a reminder, again, the link's not going to work until 7 a.m., but open a browser, leave it on your desktop, click refresh on it anytime after 7 tomorrow. Let's wrap up with a couple things. So on Friday, the next thing up is around agents. So Rick and Kirsten are going to revisit the Veeam agent technologies. Now, most people know Veeam. We are still best in breed for everything around virtualization, but there's still a lot of physical servers in environments. And oh, by the way, there's even reasons why you might still use physical or agents, which are designed for physical servers, still use those within virtual machines if you want to do selective data, or you want to handle some quiescing or managing of unusual kinds of applications. You might also put it into your endpoint devices. We've never been more decentralized than we are today. And then lastly, even for virtual machines that are running in IaaS, so Amazon EC2, in Microsoft Azure, in Google Cloud Platform, there are reasons why agent technologies provide a huge amount of power and flexibility as far as that recovery goes. And I don't think I've ever listened to Rick when I didn't learn something new. So please make sure to tune in for Friday for our normal chance for that. Otherwise, Dave Russell will be back and joining me next Monday, and we'll be covering our last of the 4 elements of the Data Protection Trends Report. By then, it'll be published, so everyone will have had a chance to see it. And then lastly, don't forget, Veeam On is coming. We're excited to have an in-person event again, and yet we recognize that so many of you were able to come last year because it was virtual. So we are going to be doing a hybrid event, providing, come back to Vegas. We want to see you in Vegas. That said, we want to have dialogue with you. And if you can't get to Vegas, we still want to connect with you. And so make sure to go to that veeam.com/Veeam On address. Julie, any last thoughts before we wrap up for today?
We'd be excited to see you either whether it's online or face-to-face. And please reach out if you have any additional questions. But the full report coming your way tomorrow.
Coming your way tomorrow. On behalf of Julie, on behalf of our colleague Dave Russell and myself, thanks for watching.
Bye.